guys. Welcome to the first recorded episode of Just Talk to the Therapist podcast. My name is Marimar and I am your host. I am a licensed clinical social worker and I am here with Elaine from Third Lady. I will let her share with you all who she is, her background. We will be asking very interesting questions related to trauma and anxiety. And thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be on this.
So, what is your professional background?
Yeah, so I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm EMDR certified. EMDR is a specific approach to treating trauma. And I am just over a year into my own private practice. I work with adults out of Phoenix, Arizona, primarily who are working through issues related to grief or life transitions, trauma, and relationships. And so a lot of my approach is looking at the relationship issues that we run into. How might that be connected to trauma experiences, whether or not we've labeled them as such? So yeah, that's the work that I do. I also love sharing a lot of this content online, primarily through Instagram, which is how we got connected. And it feels like such a fun way to make new friendships. And, what are the odds that we would ever cross paths? But on Instagram, it's kind of like, gosh, any connection is possible.
Yes, definitely. And I think that the work that you do is amazing. If you guys don't know about Elaine, you can check her out. I think her handle name is Third Place Therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Yep.
can check out the content. It's super educational, very fun, very diverse, and it will explain about grief and about anxiety, even communication. I saw that one of your posts recently was about taking accountability for
Mhm.
your own responses instead of blaming other people. And I think that it is amazing in the way that you share that. And I do think that Instagram and other social media can be definitely used for the good, and it
Mhm.
allows people to create these connections as you and I are talking here today. So
Yes, so fun.
very excited to have you here. Okay.
Mhm.
So within the specialties of what you said, right? You said that you specialize in EMDR, in
Mhm.
grief, and
Mhm.
what others, how is it that you are treating like couples and family? Do you consider your expert in
Mhm.
helping people improve communication and relationships?
Yeah, so I've kind of narrowed in my focus on working specifically with adult individuals. I do see a few couples, but primarily my practice is focused on helping the individual who's recognizing like something in life doesn't feel quite right, whether it's showing up at work and work no longer feels meaningful. And so maybe they're navigating a transition there, and grief can be wrapped up in that. Or maybe they're noticing like, hey, something in my partnership or friendships isn't going well, and they're wanting to explore what's my part of that, right? Or sometimes we can be in a difficult relationship where our partner isn't willing to go to couples therapy. And so, what do we do with that? So, my practice really is focused on just working with adult individuals with kind of a variety of presentations, but a lot of my approach to that is looking at it from a trauma informed lens. Yeah.
So when you're talking to me about trauma,
Hmm.
how do you define trauma? Or how can you share with our viewers
Hmm.
how they can identify trauma maybe in their life? Like, does it have to be something super big and meaningful that makes a change in our life? Or it can be
Hmm.
something that starts from something super simple?
Great question. I think there can be a lot of misconceptions about this because a lot of people would say, well, I don't have any trauma. Like, I had a pretty good childhood. And I think it's important to think of trauma in a couple different categories. So there can be an acute trauma, which is like a single incident that has a clear start and a clear ending. We might think of like a car accident as an acute trauma. There also can be chronic trauma, and this is where it's not just a single incident, but it's happening over time. In the case of maybe domestic violence or abuse. And then there's complex trauma. Complex trauma is interpersonal in nature. And so a lot of people in their childhood experiences could have complex trauma. Let's say if a parent wasn't able to show up emotionally available or stable for them, and maybe there was no like what we would think of a big T trauma happening, but there were interpersonal dynamics where that child felt often ashamed or humiliated, or their emotional needs weren't met. So a trauma, by definition, could be anything that overwhelms our ability to cope. So it's very individual what is traumatic. Two people could go through the same experience, and one person is going to say, that was very traumatic for me. And another person is going to say, that was an upsetting event, but I wouldn't say that it's trauma. And the difference there is, what does the impact of that event have on the individual? Some of that difference is going to be based off of what internal and external resources someone has. And what I mean by resources is, if someone is taught how to regulate their emotions well, is it, being modeled by a parent, let's say, they're going to be able to handle an overwhelming experience differently than someone who wasn't taught or demonstrated that. And then the external resources would be like, when I go through a really upsetting event, do I have people who notice that, who lean in, who offer support, or who I feel comfortable reaching out for support? Or in a really big, overwhelming experience, am I alone in it? And even further, am I shamed or embarrassed in the midst of that? So trauma can be anything that overwhelms our ability to cope, but not necessarily everything. Another helpful way to think about trauma, and I heard this in a training, was trauma can be defined as too much too soon, too much for too long, or too little for too long. So oftentimes what we can miss in thinking about trauma, and particularly childhood trauma, it's not just about what was done to me, but also what was left undone or not offered. And especially when we think about like emotional regulation and connection in those relationships. So a lot of words to kind of encompass a really big topic. Some people find that it's not helpful to label their experiences as trauma because it just doesn't feel like a fitting word. And so some people might call it like an upsetting event, or a distressing event or series of events. Other people find that actually labeling something as trauma really validates the way that they experience that event. But we can oftentimes get caught up on like, does my childhood or experience count as trauma? And I think we're kind of missing the mark if we're focused on the event rather than what's the impact it had. Yeah.
Thank you for that amazing response.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that maybe sometimes the resistance that someone can have to label, right? Because at the end of the day, as at least I tell my clients, hey, a diagnosis is just for us to know what we're treating and how to approach it, right? A diagnosis is not who you are, it's a part of you. So even saying like, hey, you have the diagnosis of trauma, it's not like you're a traumatized person, right? Because at the end of the day, we all have some trauma within us, and we're not living as a traumatized person. Like, it's something that we carry within us. But do you feel that maybe with your clients, they might show some resistance to the diagnosis because of the stigma of mental health?
That's a really great question. In my private practice, I don't take insurance. And so a lot of times in mental health, the assignment of a diagnosis is kind of required with insurance in order for them to deem that therapy is necessary and therefore worth reimbursing. So I have a little bit more flexibility with my clients to assess, is a diagnosis actually appropriate here? Do you meet criteria for it? As well as how we navigate that conversation. So I could totally see how someone who's thought of themselves as having a good childhood, I have a great relationship with my parents, but then if I'm realizing, oh, I actually experienced some childhood trauma, that almost asks us, or it feels like it's asking us to reshape our identity. Like, how do I make sense of who I am? Is my childhood now bad? Am I now a broken person? And that can be a lot to wrestle with. And so the way that I think about diagnoses is it's helpful in the way of assigning sort of a label or a category to our way of handling pain in the world. Symptoms as a strategy for managing pain. Anxiety might be the strategy of, if I can anticipate what's coming, then I won't be caught off guard or surprised by it. It ends up making life really difficult in other ways, but we can see, hey, that's actually a strategy for how I handle life, right? In PTSD, or especially complex PTSD, gosh, I struggle to trust people in relationships. That might be a strategy to keep people at an arm's length. So then I feel a bit more safe, right? And so I think when we are taking that diagnostic label and saying, this is my identity, that can be really overwhelming to try and make sense of. But if we can say, like, hey, this diagnosis means that I navigate the world with this particular set of strategies
Mhm.
that end up being unhelpful. Sometimes that helps us to not take that on as a label in our identity, but just to see like this is part of how I show up in the world. And I learned to do this. My nervous system learned to do this based on particular experiences. Genetics play a role in that. So that's how I think about diagnoses. But I think what you're sharing about how that can be a big hurdle for people is definitely really relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I speak for some people that maybe are not
Mm,
even willing to consider
yeah.
going to therapy because for several years, like mental health has been minimized. It hasn't been validated, their emotions, or socially, we're just told, get up, work, do what you got to do. And yes, you passed the pandemic and you're just supposed to show up and everything's supposed to be okay when a lot of life altering events have happened, even without that happening.
Hmm.
And I guess that with adding to what you're saying, right, that I think it's an approach of solution and it's an approach of hope and working with what you have. What I want to share with the viewers today is if you are experiencing an emotion, like that emotion is valid. And you might be sitting, as you said, like in the car and have a car accident. And maybe for the other person, that was stressful for a little bit, but it didn't impact their life in
Hmm.
a significant way. And maybe for you, it did. And that's okay. That's okay. And it's important to seek help. Like we are therapists for some clients, and for some of them, it's not for a very prolonged time. It's to
Hmm.
provide them with a set of skills so that they can further on learn how to cope and manage these situations in a productive way to live the best quality of the life that they can. So,
Totally. What you're saying makes me like feel tender for clients and folks who having a mental health diagnosis or even going to therapy is perceived negatively or like a mark against them, or it means within their family system or culture or even gender that they're weak or like something's broken. And I think I'm hopeful that with time we'll begin to accept that part of being human is that we're impacted by our experiences. And that doesn't, it's not our fault. That's part of being human. But a lot of times within those systems to then admit, like, hey, I'm impacted by this and it's been difficult for me to function normally in relationships or work or whatever, feels like I'm like admitting I'm weak or broken in some way. And I'm in this category of like mentally ill people that's like othered and shunned and bad.
yes, no, definitely. I've heard about this a lot. I think the working in this other community, which was like a federal qualified health center with minorities, like I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Hispanic. I I sometimes grew up not necessarily in my household, but hearing, mental health is for crazy people, or
Mm,
don't need that, and then perceived as weak. And I know that in many other cultures, or just like there's this social construct of you're supposed to know how to navigate everything. Don't
mm,
complain about it. Period.
mhm.
Like just suck it up until it feels better. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes this can be passed as like generational traumas about different
Mhm.
situations that have happened.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of times what can happen is when like maybe a younger generation begins to reconcile like, oh, these things actually maybe had a negative impact on me and have impacted how I show up in the world today and in relationships. And if generations above them then hear that, in order to like affirm and acknowledge the younger generation's experience, it might require the older generation to then recognize, yeah, I might have like bypassed my own pain. And so sometimes people aren't in a place of being able to acknowledge their own pain. And so from that, then they're dismissing other people's pain in it, which can be, really hurtful in families and whatnot. So, yeah, there's definitely a generational impact there in just how someone is raised, then that's going to impact how they raise their kids, and so it gets passed down through like this nurture. But we also know through epigenetics that there's like actual genetic changes that happen when we experience trauma that get passed down in our bodies. And so that part really fascinates me, and I'm not like sciencey enough to really get into the weeds there, but yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're highlighting in that. And I'm curious in your work with folks, and particularly those in a minority identity, how do you help them reconcile some of that?
Well, for me, it has been so much more in first, and this is like going to the basics, building a relationship of trust. You
Mm-hmm.
feel like you can trust someone, you are open and receptive to what that person is saying. So that's been super big. Second is sharing stories, more like universal stories, or asking about their families and maybe saying, have you ever seen this person acknowledge that they were sad, acknowledge that they were overwhelmed? So you're telling
Mm-hmm.
me that you relocated, you migrated, or you saw this event of violence in your house, or you at certain times didn't have how to eat. And how did you see your parents handle that situation? What did they
Mm-hmm.
express to you in that moment? Did you see them distressed, or did you see them just snapping or being violent, or just going away to their room? Would you see them using different substances, or trying to avoid talking about this? And it's in a like small hand signaling, hey, these struggles have always been there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people haven't actively verbalized, I feel weak, I don't know how to handle this, but maybe that's why you would see your mom crying while she was cooking,
Mhm.
or,
Mhm.
or you would see your father drinking at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and by the time that you were back from school, he was so drunk, you couldn't spend time with him, you couldn't be together. Of course, these are not always the cases, but it's more like normalizing first what they've been through, second normalizing that this is their experience, but that this, yes, trauma can define us, does impact first our brain, right? Like it's a chemical change that we have within us, but
Mhm.
that we can choose to shape our future however we want that to look like. um your trauma can impact you to a certain degree,
Mhm.
but then you can learn skills to cope and manage it, to live the best quality of life, and to have the best mental health that you potentially can,
Mhm.
everything that's happening. And it's like giving that spark of hope, giving that education, normalizing this, uh educating what is trauma. Like,
Mhm.
I remember having this conversation with this client. She was super against anything about mental health, especially about trauma, and she had gone through several traumatic incidents. And when I tell her, do you know that a trauma can be something as simple as when you were a child, you saw this tarantula walk into your room
Uh-huh.
and you got panicked. Like, you don't even know
Mhm.
what that is, but you saw it walking it towards you,
Mhm.
started yelling. You were crying, you ran out of the room, you asked for help. Um, and then as an adult, anytime that you see one in a store, out in the woods, you encounter it, that same fear that you're feeling in that moment, guess what? That is your trauma showing up.
Mhm. Mhm. Totally. Yeah. I think that that would be a trauma for me if that happened to me today, like as an adult.
Definitely.
Yeah, but I guess I know a lot of great trauma therapists, so we could work through that.
Yes.
I don't necessarily have a goal of being able to exist in a space with a spider, let alone a
Absolutely not.
tarantula. But
Absolutely not.
yeah, that's so funny. What that makes me think of is like when we experience trauma, our brain stores that memory differently from experiences that aren't traumatic. And it's as if our brain is taking like a snapshot photo of that moment. And it's almost like it gets stuck in the filing of our brain. So usually we can, with memories that aren't traumatic, our brain goes through this process of consolidating that memory, and it encodes memory as past, this happened yesterday or years ago or whatever. And it prunes the information we don't really need, keeps what's relevant, and fits that experience in with the other experiences we've had. But with the trauma, that memory doesn't get encoded as past. And so whenever there's something in the present that reminds me of that memory, whether it's a similar situation or even a similar sensation or emotion in our bodies, that memory comes center stage, and it feels as though that past trauma were happening presently. We might have the awareness it's not happening presently, but our body reads it as if I'm back in the room with that tarantula alone, no one's there to support me, and I'm very scared, right? And so this can sometimes happen when people are going through life circumstances and changes that their survival is really on the line. And so their body is responding from this place of needing to survive. But if that doesn't get processed, they might sort of be stuck in this survival mentality. And when you're just trying to survive, you don't really have the ability to be with your emotions and process those, because those parts of the brain are sort of higher functioning and go offline when we're about survival. So sometimes what can be happening in especially like first generation individuals, which I don't have this lived experience, but clients who've trusted me with their stories and experiences, that mom or dad had to be in survival mode
Yeah.
when they immigrated, and maybe weren't afforded the opportunity to process that. And they might still be operating out of that place of survival. Whereas the adult child now is stable enough, like life is stable enough to actually be able to process those other things. And so sometimes I can see that being like a miss in parents and adult children, and kind of what's showing up in that for them. I'm curious if that resonates with anything that you see in the work that you do. Yeah.
And sometimes much more than the stability, because sometimes they are here and they're stable. Like
Mhm.
externally, you could see stability, but internally, it's not perceived. And it's our brain, it's not catching, like we're not in the same circumstances, like, right? Like that's one of the symptoms of what trauma is, like those reoccurring thoughts, like the re-experiencing, you feel like it's happening all over again. You're having nightmares, you're constantly fearing, and um it's maybe giving this message of, again, like hope, of even though you felt this way for so long, doesn't mean that you have to feel this way forever. And if you
Mm-hmm.
feel like this occasionally, because here I come signaling, even with the people that are doing trauma work, and are actively going to therapy or finish their therapy sessions, like maybe you have a trauma anniversary
Mm-hmm.
and your body feels that and your mind remembers that. And maybe there's a specific song in a specific place that triggers that trauma and sets it off. So, um, in this case, what I want to say, like, even when you do the work, you can still experience some symptoms. And part of the
Mm-hmm.
purpose of therapy is not completely removing them away, but teaching how to manage that, were that to happen again.
Totally. Yeah. Building up this resilience. I think a lot of times, understandably, we can want to approach life with knowing what's coming and anticipating it.
Oh, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. If I can control the outcome, that would be great. And a lot of times we can spiral ourselves into this exhausted anxiety, or our life becomes very small because this is the only bit that I can control. And so instead, I think at least my demeanor towards therapy is, hey, how can we accept the reality that we can't predict what's going to happen in life? We can't know that. But we can develop this sense of I can handle it and I don't have to handle it alone. That's where the relationship piece comes in, is like I can't control what's going to happen if I'm going to lose my job or, if something's going to happen to my partner or my family, but I don't have to navigate that alone. Like I have people who are going to be with me in that pain, whatever pain might be coming my way. Yeah.
I love working with anxiety. Like, I absolutely love working with anxiety. And I think one of the reasons why, and this is kind of a self-disclosure, I have a 3-year-old daughter.
Mm-hmm.
After giving birth, I had postpartum depression and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
I was not aware what postpartum anxiety was. Like, I don't feel like that was talked about enough. And then I guess I was nice enough that it wanted to hang out with me still.
Mm-hmm. So you became good friends. Mm-hmm.
We became good friends, yes. It wasn't a very nice company at the beginning. I had panic attacks. I would be having these like irrational thoughts, right? Like I would sit down and I would say, like, I feel like so unproductive. Like I am the laziest person in the world, which was like, I just did a bunch of things. Like, what, where is this even coming from? And I did get help and support in it. Obviously, like I have my background in education, but I think that for any mental health provider to be watching this, it is important to take care of yourself. Like you're a professional, but it's also important to acknowledge any symptom that you might have and then just ask for help and support. I feel like just that sense of community and normalizing, or maybe when you're in the situation, you don't necessarily see the simple tasks and techniques that you can use that can help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the relationship has definitely developed, and now we're
Mm-hmm.
friends. We are.
Mm-hmm.
I just keep it on a corner. It's in timeout.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I love that. Yeah.
but what the reason why I bring up anxiety is because it's made me way more empathetic in treating my clients, understanding how they're feeling, what they're going through, but also in seeing what other things also help. Like, for example, nutrition. That
Mm-hmm.
sometimes is very overlooked in what is treating
Yeah.
anxiety. Like,
Yeah.
what you eat really does impact. It sets off your day, how you feel. If you start off your day with a super huge Starbucks with extra pumps of everything,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
nothing against Starbucks,
Mm-hmm.
but it probably will make you feel more anxious if you're eating more processed food, if you're not eating a lot of vegetables, if maybe you have vitamin deficiencies. Um, that's something important, like the physical movement. And when people hear like exercise, they literally visualize like exercise. And I say, no, like exercise
Mm-hmm.
can be put on music in your living room and dance away. Go for a walk with your dog, with your family, go swimming. Stretch, do yoga, do something that your body feels that movement. And also, this is the cognitive part in how much are we really in control of? Who are we
Mm-hmm.
kidding yourself? Like,
Yeah.
you aren't. You set a plan of what you want to do in the day, but there's so many things that are out of your control, right? Like, hence the word like accidents, unpredictable. You can
Mm-hmm.
have a whole telehealth day and all of a sudden like you don't have internet connection, your phone isn't working, you don't have the hotspot, you can't find an
Mm-hmm.
appointment. Guess what, you have to reschedule those appointments.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of things that we truly aren't in control of, and when we acknowledge that
Mm-hmm.
and we accept it, right? Because sometimes we know it, we just don't want to accept it, we still want to feel like we're in control. It can be a coping
Mm-hmm.
mechanism of trauma, but still. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
it allows us to navigate the relationship with anxiety definitely different. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if
Yeah, I
you have
think.
some input about that, because I know that you also put that you treat anxiety. Um,
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, I think anxiety and trauma have a close relationship because, trauma is like prolonged stress,
mhm.
basically, right? And anxiety can kind of show up similar to that as well. Um, but what you were saying reminded me of something that was a really big pivot for me as a therapist. I was in this training and the trainer was saying that we have this idea, at least maybe in the West, that our mind lives in our brain and mental health is like brain health, but where our mind is actually like our body and our brain and all of that together. And so that's the piece where working with our body, listening to our bodies is a part of our mental health and is a part of our holistic wellness. And there's like a mind in our body, if you will, right? Some people call the gut like your second brain. Doesn't have as many like neurons as your head brain, but your gut actually sends 8 times more messages to your brain than your brain does to your body. So there's a lot of information there that we could tap into. And just on the note of nutrition, like, yeah, nutritional deficiencies will definitely impact our body and that will impact our brain and how we're sorting through information. I once came across this nutritionist who was saying that if you're waking up feeling anxious, it could be that your body doesn't have enough fuel before you went to bed. And so your body, when it doesn't have that fuel, then begins to produce cortisol, which is our stress hormone. So if you're waking up feeling really stressed, it could be because you're actually not getting adequate nutrition. And you maybe ate too early in the evening before going to bed. And that was just mind blowing to me. Like that makes so much
Yeah,
sense.
definitely mind blowing to
Mhm.
me too.
Yeah. And I'm like, dang, okay. Permission to eat whenever I'm hungry and making sure that as I'm going to bed, um, I'm fed enough and have that fuel. And yeah, caffeine definitely has an impact in different people's bodies in different ways. But for those who lean towards anxiety, somehow we seem to gravitate towards caffeine and the venti lattes and all of that. But for a lot of people, even adjusting that down to half decaf or decaf altogether and just noticing how does my body feel on this when I
Mhm.
don't that caffeine, that can be a really big piece to a holistic wellness and part of our mental health, not just about our brain, but incorporating our bodies too. So I think you highlight a really important piece that can oftentimes get missed in that. Yeah.
I've been super interested in that for quite a while. I haven't gotten certified in that yet. I've taken some like continued education in the place that I work in right now. They have a nutritionist there, and she provided a CEU about mental
Mm-hmm.
health and nutrition
Mm-hmm.
and vitamin deficiencies and all of this. And it was even more of the broader education of wow, like this makes a really big impact. And sometimes there's small changes that we make. If you say, well, how am I gonna eat out if I'm super busy all the time? Then you can meal prep some things. Like you can meal prep your snacks. You can start with that. Maybe not your meals. Maybe meal prep your snacks, the ones that you get out that are more the junk food, like the Coke and the sodas and all that you're eating. So yeah, healthy habits for the win. I'm so interested to know like what made you have this passion about trauma, anxiety, and grief? Like what made you say those are my specialties? Those are the ones that I want to treat. I'm going for a private practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I would bet that your graduate degree program and training maybe was pretty similar to mine in that it's pretty broad. Like you're taught to work with all different ages and issues. And so you get out of grad school knowing a bit about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And so part of that process was just like working with clients and seeing, what am I naturally more curious about and inclined towards. I've experienced a bit of grief and lost a close family member. And so moving through that process, I think, like you're saying with your anxiety, gave me a lot of compassion and empathy, unfortunately, for those kinds of experiences. And so I love to get to work with folks who've had that kind of a loss and are processing how do I make sense of this and digest that experience. And then I think along the way, kind of when you're a newer therapist, I don't know if your experience was like this, but you're kind of told to pick some modality or theory to operate from. And a supervisor I had at the time said, EMDR is a really great place to start. so I took an EMDR training and it felt like everything just clicked. Like, yes, of course, what's showing up today, your anxiety at work, like could truly be about what's going on at work. And the way that you're navigating that probably is informed by your earlier experiences. And so that's where like the trauma informed approach just really clicked and made sense for me. In that particular modality, just felt like it gelled well with me. So I don't know that as I was like launching into therapy, I knew these are the things I want to focus on. But in that work, it's just kind of like what's bubbled up. Yeah.
I think that, at least from what I've observed from different therapists, unless you are just following another person's like step, when you
Mm-hmm.
genuinely allow yourself to say, I feel like I can help people overcome this because I've worked through this path, or I am not here to like solve this problem for myself, but to show people there's a way through, because maybe I was in that position and I didn't, it took me some time, but I was able to get through this,
Mm-hmm.
right? That leads us to do our work in a very genuine way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so thank you for sharing that with
Mm-hmm.
me. Um, what has been your most, let's say, like within the HIPAA compliance,
Uh-huh.
the client success story, or that client story that has really like stayed with you and impacted you and has made you want to continue being the therapist that you are today?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Yeah, and I think there's so many I guess I'll say like thematically across a lot of clients, I think what I treasure most is these moments where therapy slows down and we're just experiencing what is it like to get to share this, whether it's a story or your pain or whatever, with someone else.
Mhm.
And I genuinely feel in that, like, gosh, it's such an honor to be trusted with someone's authentic, like, vulnerability and emotion and pain. And so I think when I have those sessions where we've reached that point, there's enough trust, and a client is sharing that, and we're just lingering in what is it like to be in this together. And though we're not like fixing the past or solving what happened, like to be together in it, can we linger in that? And I think that can be some of the most powerful moments of transformation. And there might be a lot of silence in that moment, just as like we sit in it, but that felt sense of like someone else is with me in my pain, and still leaning in. Like I think that's some of the most transformative work. And I feel like tickled that I get to do that as a therapist. It's just like such a sweet moment. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%.
Mm.
I've said, and I do tell people, like, it is such an honor to me that you're here, that you trust me, that you talk to me, that you allow yourself to be vulnerable with maybe some of the most shameful for you or uncomfortable situations that you've ever been through. Like, I appreciate that so much. Um, so I feel like we're on the same page, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're almost summing up. I
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to know, with everything that you treat, trauma being something so
Mm-hmm.
heavy, not just for the clients, but sometimes for you when you're working maybe back to back in sessions. What do you do as your self-care?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think, yeah, for my self-care, think when the work feels hard, like all work is going to have elements of it being hard and just being work. But I think when I feel stuck, my curiosity towards myself is like, what's coming up perhaps in my own story? And then having a place to be able to process that with my own therapist or my own, community, and to get the support that I need. So that's something that I find as a really valuable thing to know, like, the hard days don't stop at me. Like I have people that I can bring that to and process it with and get support in, if there's something going on at work that feels tough to navigate through, or in my personal life, right? So knowing, hey, I have a place and I have that support, that's been a really big piece of my self-care. I think also like playing and enjoying life outside of being in the really heavy stuff. that has been a really great way to hold the reality that life is incredibly painful, also really wonderful and beautiful. And being in that tension, I think therapists, like a lot of our days, are spent on the hard stuff. And so making sure outside of that space, am I prioritizing play and connection and meaning? And then I think just kind of in my worldview and spirituality, I do feel this deep sense of hope. And that although there's a lot of like heavy, really painful, awful things, the hope far outweighs that. And that's just kind of like a sense that I have inside that I hope I always hold on to. But yeah, I genuinely feel like so honored and not burdened by clients and whatever pain or challenge they're bringing in. And I think just really recognizing how precious it is to be entrusted with that and get to wrestle through it, not necessarily having the answers for the client as much as, hey, let's explore this together and use your intuition and my intuition together to sense what's going on here and what we need. I think a lot of times, and this was maybe more true in my earlier career as therapists, you can tell me if you relate, like we have this perception, I need to have all the answers for my client, I need to fix them, and I need to do it quick, right?
Yeah.
And that's just not human. And if we're approaching therapy in that way, there are some situations where maybe that's a really great fit.
If you were
But in
in the
trauma,
program.
sure, right. Yeah. But when it's trauma, and especially if it's complex trauma where there's an interpersonal nature to it, I think we have to posture ourselves more with this compassionate curiosity and letting the work unfold. Um, and I think that that can have its own challenges. But um, yeah, that's what's working for me right now. And I think I hope it continues to work because I really just feel like I love that I get to do exactly what I want to be doing, which is really special. I'm
Oh,
curious to bounce that back to you. Like, what does your self-care look like?
so for me, I love plants. So everything
Uh-huh.
like gardening, you will see me taking care of my plants, going out for walks,
Mm-hmm.
just looking for different things to do. Sometimes I want to rest and I give myself permission to rest, like have a whole lazy day and just like order food from outside and watch a movie. Sometimes that's sitting down and painting, even though I wouldn't say I'm very skilled at it, very
Mm-hmm.
questionable. I would say that's almost like pre-K work, but I definitely enjoy doing it too. Spending time with loved ones. And a really funny fact about me is if you were to
Mm-hmm.
see my Netflix account or any of them
Mm-hmm.
here, like you would not think I am a therapist. Like everything that I watch is like comedy, super cheesy, like super light, because
Mm-hmm.
I have enough seriousness in my life
Yeah.
with my
Mm-hmm.
job, with sometimes things that I have to handle that I will do that. I will have books there where I can read either motivational memoirs or
Mm-hmm.
just about anything. I love to cook. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I love exploring like different recipes, just something where I'm also learning, I guess, or recharging. I love
Mm-hmm.
meditation. Even in my days at work, I will set aside like 5 minutes and I will meditate.
Good.
And for me, like spirituality is also a very big component of me
Mm-hmm.
being able to continue spreading the hope. Um, Whatever I tell people, like if they don't believe in anything like that is super respectful. If you do, I say it's important for you to have some type of communication, relationship, and delegate. It's like having the safety net that maybe you won't ever need, but it's there
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Yeah.
there for you. And it's humongous and it's more to the extent of what you can ever feel. And I think that like being in connection with that plus like the self-care and everything else, it definitely does help. Plus therapy, definitely.
Yeah.
100%.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
So you are an amazing therapist, super knowledgeable. How can someone book an appointment with you?
Yeah. So I'm licensed in Arizona and work with adults only in Arizona. So through my website, just www.thirdplacetherapy.com, there's a contact form there. For those who aren't in Arizona, I created a free ebook guide for basically it's all about identifying the issues in your relationship and how that might be connected to your trauma. And then what do we do with that, right? How do we navigate the conflict showing up in relationship in a way that's like mindful and productive and helpful? And how do we address that trauma that's coming up? So that free ebook is accessible to anyone with an email, and you can find that on my Instagram, Third Place Therapy. Just the link in bio has that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am so honored, happy,
Mm.
grateful that you shared this space with me and with everybody else that will be seeing this video. Don't forget, people, to tune in to the weekly episodes every Tuesday. This is an amazing episode to learn about trauma, anxiety, normalizing mental health care, and also self care for therapists. So, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you soon.